7th of October, 1944, 6:32 a.m., Vosges Mountains, eastern France. Cold fog clings to the pine trees as the crack of rifle fire snaps through the damp morning air. Mud sucks at boots. Somewhere in the grey forest a wounded man cries out in English. A machine gun rattles from the hillside. Leaves shiver with every burst. American soldiers press themselves against the wet ground, breathing hard, hands trembling on their rifles. And moving carefully through the smoke and fog are men whose families, thousands of miles away, are locked behind barbed wire in the United States. They move forward anyway. The soldiers crawling through the cold forests of France belong to the 442nd Infantry Regiment. Within weeks, they will perform one of the most daring rescue missions in American military history. But on this morning, none of them know that history is watching. They only know the enemy is close. And the order is simple. Advance. The story of these soldiers does not begin in France. It begins years earlier, across the Pacific Ocean, in the islands of Hawaii and the cities of the American mainland. Long before the gunfire in the Vosges forests, their lives were shaped by two identities that often collided. They were Americans and they were Japanese. Many of the young men who would form the 442nd Infantry Regiment were second-generation Japanese Americans, known as Nisei. Their parents had immigrated to the United States decades earlier, building small businesses, working farms, raising families. Their sons grew up speaking English, attending American schools, playing baseball, and pledging allegiance to the American flag. Then history changed everything. December the 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shook the United States to its core. Japanese aircraft roared over the harbor at dawn, dropping bombs and torpedoes that crippled the Pacific Fleet. Smoke poured from the battleships. Fires burned across the base. More than 2,000 Americans were killed in a single morning. Shock quickly turned into fear, and fear turned into suspicion. Across the mainland United States, Japanese Americans suddenly found themselves viewed as potential enemies. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order authorized the forced relocation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. More than 110,000 men, women, and children were removed from their homes and sent to remote internment camps. Barbed wire surrounded the camps. Armed guards stood watch. Families lived in cramped wooden barracks in deserts and remote valleys. Dust storms swept through the camps in summer. Winters were bitterly cold. Many internees had committed no crime. Their only connection to the enemy was their ancestry. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, the situation was different. The islands had a large Japanese American population, and removing them all would have crippled the economy. Instead, thousands of Nisei men already serving in the Hawaii National Guard were placed under suspicion but remained in uniform. These soldiers were soon reorganized into a special unit that would quietly begin rewriting American military history. The 100th Infantry Battalion, known as the 1 Puka Puka, a nickname drawn from Hawaiian slang for the number 1. The battalion was composed almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers from Hawaii. In 1942, they were shipped to the mainland United States for training. Their destination was Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. The winter was brutal. Many of the soldiers had never seen snow before. They trained in freezing temperatures, marching through deep drifts, learning the tactics of infantry combat. Despite doubts from some officers and suspicion from parts of the American public, the battalion quickly gained a reputation for discipline and determination. But even as they trained, a larger decision was forming inside the U.S. War Department. Could Japanese Americans serve in combat units? Could they be trusted on the battlefield? The announcement triggered a powerful response across the internment camps of the United States. Young men stepped forward to volunteer for military service. Some walked past the same barbed wire fences that surrounded their families. Others signed enlistment papers while their parents remained imprisoned in relocation centers. Why volunteer for a country that had imprisoned your family? For many of them, the answer was simple. They wanted to prove their loyalty. They wanted to prove they were Americans. Recruiters were stunned by the response. Thousands volunteered. From Hawaii alone, more than 10,000 Nisei applied to join the new unit. Only a fraction could be accepted. Training began at Camp Shelby. There, The new regiment trained relentlessly in the heat and humidity of the Deep South. Long marches, field exercises, live fire drills. Officers drilled the soldiers in infantry tactics, mountain warfare, and coordinated assaults. The regiment eventually formed 3 infantry battalions: the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3 road attached artillery units. Engineers, medical teams. Together they formed a regimental combat team designed for independent operations on the battlefield. Meanwhile, far away across the Atlantic Ocean, the 100th Infantry Battalion was already fighting in Europe. In 1943, they were deployed to the Mediterranean Theatre and assigned to the 34th Infantry Division. Soon they were fighting their first major battles in the mountains of Italy. The terrain was unforgiving: steep hills, narrow valleys, German defensive lines carved into stone ridges, yet they kept advancing. Again and again their commanders sent them into difficult assaults. Again and again the battalion pushed forward through machine gun fire and artillery bombardments. The casualty rate became so high that soldiers began to call them something else. The Purple Heart Battalion. By the summer of 1944, the battalion had earned respect from commanders who had once doubted them. Their courage on the battlefield had begun to change perceptions, and soon they would no longer fight alone. Because across the ocean, the newly trained 442nd Regimental Combat Team was preparing to join them. Young soldiers boarded troopships bound for Europe. Some carried letters from families still living behind barbed wire in American internment camps. Others carried photographs of parents they had not seen in years. They were about to enter one of the most dangerous theaters of World War II. And within months, this unit of volunteers would face a mission so desperate, so deadly, that military historians would later struggle to explain how they survived in the dark forests of France. Surrounded by German forces, hundreds of American soldiers would soon be trapped, and only one unit would be sent to bring them out. June 26, 1944, 5:10 a.m., hills south of Rome, Italy. A pale orange sunrise spread slowly across the shattered countryside. Artillery echoes through the valleys like distant thunder. The air smells of dust, burned powder, and crushed olive trees. American soldiers crouch behind stone walls, their uniforms streaked with sweat and mud. A whistle cuts through the morning air. Then the order comes. Advance. Among the men climbing the rocky slope are soldiers of the 100th Infantry Battalion, already hardened by months of brutal fighting. Their reputation is growing with every battle, but the cost has been staggering. Companies that once marched hundreds of men into combat now count their survivors by the dozen. German machine guns open fire from hidden bunkers along the ridge. Dirt explodes around the advancing infantry. Men drop to the ground, pressing their helmets into the soil as bullets snap overhead. Still, the soldiers of the 100th push forward. They have learned something about war in Italy. The only way out is through. The battalion had first entered combat months earlier in the rugged mountains south of Rome while attached to the 34th Infantry Division. Their task was simple on paper: break through the German defensive lines and open the road to the Italian capital. But the enemy waiting for them belonged to the Wehrmacht, veterans of years of fighting across Europe. They had turned the Italian landscape into a fortress. Machine gun nests were hidden in caves and ruined farmhouses. Mortars were placed on ridgelines. Artillery batteries waited behind the mountains. Every hill had to be taken the hard way, one step at a time, one life at a time. The 100th Infantry Battalion quickly proved something remarkable. Despite the intense pressure and the heavy casualties, the Nassau soldiers fought with relentless determination. Officers began to notice their discipline during assaults. They rarely hesitated under fire. They advanced when ordered, even when the terrain seemed impossible. In one engagement near the town of Belvedere, Italy, the battalion attacked steep defensive positions that had already stalled other Allied units. The slopes were exposed. German gunners had clear lines of fire. Casualties mounted quickly, but the soldiers kept climbing. By the end of the assault, the ridge was captured. The cost had been severe, but the battalion had done what many believed impossible. Their commanders began to understand something important. These soldiers were not just fighting the enemy in front of them. They were fighting doubt, suspicion, and prejudice that stretched all the way back to the United States. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, The rest of the regiment was preparing to join the fight to T-Camp Shelby. The newly formed 442nd Regimental Combat Team had spent more than a year training. The soldiers ran obstacle courses under the brutal Mississippi sun. They marched mile after mile with heavy packs. They practiced coordinated assaults with artillery support and machine gun teams. Many of the men training there carried emotional burdens heavier than their equipment. Letters from home often arrived weeks late. Inside them were stories from internment camps like Manzanar War Relocation Center and Heart Mountain War Relocation Center. Parents describe harsh winters in poorly insulated barracks. Dust storms blowing through the camps. Armed guards watching over them, yet those same parents often wrote something else. Fight well, show them who we are. They also carried something else, experience. Soon the 100th Infantry Battalion was officially attached to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, though it kept its historic name and identity. Together, they formed one of the most unique fighting forces in the entire United States Army. Japanese-American soldiers, fighting for a nation that had imprisoned many of their families, and proving themselves with every battle. The regiment quickly entered combat in Italy during the summer of 1944. One of their earliest major operations took place near the town of Livorno along the western coast. The objective was to push German forces north and secure supply routes for the advancing Allied armies. Once again, the terrain was brutal. The hills were thick with vineyards, stone walls, and narrow farm roads that made movement slow and dangerous. German defenders had placed mines along the approaches. Snipers hid among ruined buildings. The soldiers of the 442nd advanced carefully, clearing one position after another. Infantry squads moved with artillery support from the regiment's own artillery battalion, whose guns thundered across the countryside. The fighting was fierce, but something remarkable began to happen. Commanders noticed that the regiment consistently achieved its objectives. Positions that had resisted earlier assaults suddenly fell after determined attacks by the Nisei soldiers. Word spread through Allied headquarters. The 442nd could be trusted with the toughest missions. Their motto reflected that reputation. It was simple: go for broke. The phrase came from Hawaiian gambling slang, meaning to risk everything in one bold move. It perfectly captured the spirit of the regiment: risk everything. Hold nothing back. By the late summer of 1944, the Allied command made an important decision. Instead of keeping the regiment in Italy, they would move it to a new front, France. There, in the dense forests of the Vosges Mountains, American forces were advancing toward the German border. But the terrain was some of the most difficult in Europe: thick pine forests, steep ridges, narrow muddy roads, perfect ground for ambushes. German units defending the region were experienced and determined to slow the Allied advance. Every hilltop could hide a machine gun. Every forest path could conceal a sniper. When the 442nd arrived in France in the fall of 1944, they were immediately thrown into combat. The weather had turned cold, rain soaked the ground, turning forest trails into rivers of mud. Fog drifted through the trees, limiting visibility. Then, in October 1944, a desperate message reached American command. An entire battalion from the 141st Infantry Regiment had advanced too far into the Vosges forests. German forces had surrounded them. Nearly 300 American soldiers were now trapped behind enemy lines. Attempts to reach them had already failed. Other units had tried to break through the German defenses and had been pushed back with heavy losses. The trapped men were running out of food, running out of ammunition, running out of time. Commanders needed a unit capable of pushing through some of the toughest defenses in the region, and there was one regiment that had already proven it could do exactly that. Orders were issued. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would lead the rescue mission. But the soldiers about to receive those orders had no idea what it would cost, because somewhere ahead in the dark forests of the Vosges, German machine guns were already waiting. The 24th of October, 1944, 4:40 a.m., Vosges Mountains, eastern France. A cold rain falls through the dark pine forest. Mud clings to boots and rifles alike. The forest floor is slick with fallen needles and shattered branches from artillery blasts. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the fog, German machine guns begin to chatter again. The sound echoes between the hills like ripping cloth. American soldiers crouch behind trees, breathing hard in the freezing air. And at the front of the assault line are the men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They have already been fighting for days, and the worst is still ahead. German forces had closed in from all sides. The surrounded men belonged to what would later be known as the Lost Battalion. Supplies were running dangerously low. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food had been reduced to scraps. German artillery shelled their position day and night. Attempts to reach them had already failed. Several American units had tried to break through the German lines. Each time they were forced back. The terrain favored the defenders. Thick forest blocked visibility. Steep slopes slowed attackers to a crawl. German machine gun nests were hidden in carefully prepared positions. To reach the trap soldiers, someone would have to fight through all of it. American commanders turned to the unit that had already proven it could do the impossible. The 442nd orders came down from the 36th Infantry Division: break through the German lines, reach the trap battalion, bring them out. The regiment began its advance through the forest under constant fire. Rain turned the ground into deep mud that swallowed boots with every step. Visibility dropped to only a few yards in the dense trees. German defenders opened fire from hidden bunkers. Mortars exploded among the branches overhead, sending deadly splinters of wood raining down. Still the soldiers kept moving. Day after day the regiment attacked the German positions. Each hill was taken only after brutal close combat. Squads crawled forward under machine gun fire, tossing grenades into bunkers and dugouts. Casualties mounted quickly. Entire platoons were reduced to a handful of men. But the advance continued. In one particularly desperate assault, soldiers of the 442nd were ordered to charge a heavily defended ridge blocking the route to the trap battalion. The slope was steep and exposed. German machine guns had perfect lines of fire. The order was clear: attack anyway. Men fixed bayonets, then they ran uphill into the storm of bullets. The fighting became chaotic and brutal. Rifle fire cracked at point-blank range. Grenades exploded among the trees. Soldiers slipped in the mud while trying to reach the enemy trenches. But slowly, painfully, the line began to move forward. Meanwhile, on the ridge where the trap soldiers waited, the situation had become desperate. The men of the Lost Battalion had been cut off for nearly a week. German patrols were tightening the circle around them. Medical supplies were almost gone. Some wounded soldiers had gone days without treatment. Through the fog and gunfire, they could sometimes hear the distant sounds of battle. Someone was trying to reach them. They just didn't know who. Back in the attacking lines, the 442nd continued pushing forward despite enormous losses. By the time they approached the final German defensive positions, the regiment had already suffered hundreds of casualties, yet the soldiers refused to stop. They knew American lives depended on them. On the morning of October 30th, 1944, the final assault began. The surviving companies of the 442nd launched one last attack against the German positions guarding the trap battalion. Artillery thundered across the forest. Infantry squads moved forward through smoke and shattered trees. Then suddenly the German line began to break. Some defenders retreated. Others were overrun in close combat. And finally, through the trees, American soldiers saw something remarkable. Other Americans, dirty, exhausted, hungry but alive. The soldiers of the 442nd had reached the Lost Battalion. When the rescue was complete, approximately 211 trapped soldiers were brought out of the forest. But the cost was staggering to save them. The 442nd had suffered more than 800 casualties. The rescue became one of the most famous actions of the entire war, and it cemented the reputation of the regiment as one of the most courageous fighting units in American military history. But their story did not end there. Throughout the war, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team continued fighting across Europe. By the time the war ended in 1945, the regiment had become the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the entire history of the United States Army. The numbers alone are extraordinary. The unit received over 18,000 individual decorations for bravery, more than 4,000 Purple Hearts, and 21 soldiers from the regiment were eventually awarded the nation's highest military honor, the Medal of Honor. Many of these awards were granted decades later, after historical reviews corrected earlier decisions influenced by wartime prejudice. The soldiers had always earned them. History simply needed time to recognize it. When the war ended and the surviving veterans returned home, They came back to a country that was slowly beginning to confront the injustice of the wartime internment camps. Their service had changed something. Their courage had helped reshape how Americans viewed Japanese American citizens. In later years, the legacy of the regiment continued to grow. Historians studied their battles. Military academies analyzed their tactics. Their story became a symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and determination in the face of discrimination. Decades after the war, the surviving veterans of the 442nd were honored once again when the United States Congress awarded the unit the Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their extraordinary service. By then, many of the men who had fought in the forests of France were elderly. Some walked with canes. Others carried memories that never faded. But when they gathered together, they often remembered the same thing, not the medals, not the fame. They remembered the men beside them in the mud and the rain. The soldiers who had charged up hills under machine gun fire. The soldiers who had not made it home. The story of the 442nd is not just a story about World War I. It is a story about identity, about loyalty tested in the hardest possible way, and about a group of young men who chose to risk everything for a nation that had doubted them. Go for broke. 3 simple words. A motto spoken by soldiers who believe that sometimes the only way forward is to give everything you have. And even today, as historians continue to examine the battles of World War II, one question still echoes through the forests of the Vosges and the hills of Italy. What would have happened if those soldiers had chosen not to fight?